From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump says tariffs on Mexico and Canada are going forward on schedule soon, but does he mean it this time, or is this more negotiating bluster? As a new study suggests, it could raise the cost of an SUV made in North America by something like $9,000. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. When Donald Trump gave America's neighbors and close trading partners a 30-day trade war ceasefire 3 weeks ago, companies and financial markets were breathing a sigh of relief. But this week, the president suggested that this leeway is almost up. Listen to this, taken from a cabinet meeting today.
April 2nd. I was going to do it on April 1st, but I'm a little bit superstitious. I made it April 2nd. The tariffs go on. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I think you're going to see something that's going to be amazing. We've been taken advantage of as a country for a long period of time. We've been tariffed, but we didn't tariff. Now, I did when I was here. We took in $700 billion from China. $700 billion. Not one president in the history of our country took in 10 cents from China. At the same time, China respected us.
And here the president is making the argument for border taxes on Canada specifically.
If we don't give them cars, we don't have to give them cars. The tariffs will make it impossible for them to sell cars into the United States. The tariffs will make it impossible for them to sell lumber or anything else into the United States. And all I'm asking to do is break even or lose a little bit, but not lose $200 billion. And we love Canada. I love Canada. I love the people of Canada. And but honestly, it's not fair for us to be supporting Canada. And if we don't support them, they don't subsist as a nation.
Alicia, what's your reaction to the president's remarks there? And the Journal's editorials today include a write-up on a new study specifically of the North American auto industry. But what are the estimates that are provided there?
Right. So what you have to keep in mind is that U.S., Canada, and Mexico are really interdependent. And since NAFTA in 1994, there's been a lot of integration in terms of supply chains, and especially the auto industry, in which parts are sometimes made in Mexico or Canada or sometimes in the U.S., and they cross back and forth across the borders multiple times. And so if you were to slap a 25% tariff on it, as Donald Trump is threatening, you are going to raise the prices of every single component, and you'll have a multiplier effect. So there was a new study in Anderson Economic Group, which has actually some clients in the auto industry, and they presented this study last week at an automotive conference, and they found when they did all the calculations based on where the components come from, et cetera, that a full-size SUV that's assembled in North America, the cost would increase by about $9,000. For a pickup truck, that's about $8,000. Those are bigger cars, but they are also the ones that make up about 2/3 of sales in the U.S. Sedans are a small and shrinking share of the auto market here for various reasons. They also found that the cost of an EV crossover would increase by even more, at $12,200. And some of that's because actually, these are bigger cars for their battery packs. They require more steel and aluminum, but they also need a lot of critical minerals. And Canada is actually our biggest source of some of these minerals, including nickel. Canada supplies more than half of our nickel. And by the way, the other big source of nickel in the world, Russia. So we are actually very dependent on Canada for some goods. And by the way, I would also mention uranium to power our nuclear plants. So Donald Trump's belief that, well, U.S. can go on its own and we don't need Canada and that we are helping support Canada, well, we have a reciprocal relationship. They actually help support us in many ways, too.
Part of the argument here is that these supply chains have become integrated over many years. And so there are auto parts that come from Canada, come from Mexico, get added to other parts, then maybe get re-exported and added to create some other piece of an automobile that is ultimately turned into a car that the consumer buys. And it takes a long time to redo those supply chains. The Trump response to that criticism, I think, is probably that they should make all those parts in Michigan and the United States as well. But at least in the short term, that is not feasible. And notable that you're hearing similar sort of arguments on the metal metal tariffs that Trump has also promised. Those are supposed to be imposed starting in mid-March, though prices are already going up. You see news reports saying that hot-rolled coil prices for steel in the Midwest are up 20% since President Trump took office. And then notable that the Journal's news pages had a report on aluminum. The CEO of Alcoa, this is a headline, warns 100,000 U.S. industry jobs at risk due to Trump's proposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. And this is reporting on comments that the Alcoa CEO made at a conference. But one of the ones that really stuck out to me, Monet, is this. He says, we make decisions around aluminum production that have a horizon of 20 to 40 years. We would not be making an investment in the United States based on a tariff structure that could be in place for a much shorter period of time. So the difficulty here is that Trump's argument is all this stuff should be insourced to the United States, but the cost and the decision to build a new aluminum plant in the United States is a big one, an expensive one, and one that does not operate on 4-year presidential timelines.
Yeah, I think the commonality between that critique of the Trump tariffs with regard to the U.S. auto industry and then the effect that the aluminum tariffs are going to have on aluminum production in the country is the fact that it's very difficult for all of these companies to be able to reorient their supply chains and their production operations. These tariffs are something that Trump often conceives essentially on a whim. They're something that don't have very broad support in the American political system. And so if you are a CEO who's trying to project your costs and decide what the most efficient way to produce will be, there's no way that you can reliably say that these tariffs are going to be in place for decades to come. And so that means that aluminum producers in this country, as well as other people who theoretically would be beneficiaries of U.S. protectionism, aren't going to be making big investment decisions just based on the fact that Trump right now in February 2025 is saying that he's going to impose tariffs. For some of these auto parts, for example, there are a lot of ones that probably do have comparable U.S. suppliers where someone like Ford could say, okay, we might be paying a slight premium based on what we normally were used to importing from Canada, but this part has a ready-made equivalent in the U.S. We're just going to go ahead and shift our purchases there. But there are others that are very rare and are custom-made, essentially, and they're going to have to essentially pay that 25% addition and then find a way to pass that on to consumers via increased prices. So I do think that there probably are certain U.S. companies that are on the production side of some of these goods that are going to benefit from having prices increased on their foreign competitors. But if you even look at steel tariffs in Trump's first term, U.S. Steel was one of the companies that was pushing those the hardest. And yet after the steel tariffs were imposed, they didn't really see their production or U.S. sales increase by nearly as much as they projected, probably because of that inability to increase capacity quickly as much as they had hoped. And so it's interesting that tariffs create these costs for people who are importing and these difficulties, but often they don't even create the commensurate benefits for U.S. producers because of how impermanent they can be.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back.
The other thing that strikes me about this aluminum story, Alicia, is there seems to be a real example of competitive advantage here. Jumping off the Journal's reporting again, it says that electricity makes up 40% the cost of operating an aluminum smelter. And so one of the reasons that this aluminum business has shifted into Canada is because they have access to pretty cheap electricity generated by hydropower. And if U.S. energy costs are going up, Canadian energy costs are going down. And that explains why the U.S. has come to rely on aluminum imports from Canada. And again, you can keep tracing problems in the U.S. back and say maybe we should be building more hydropower, more dams in the United States. It's an argument for a different time, but at the very least, it's not something that is going to be solved within the timeline of the kind of tariff changes that Trump is proposing. And similar, I guess I would say, to the other product that he mentioned there that the U.S. gets a lot from Canada is lumber. And if you want to keep the price of new homes from rising as fast, we need low-cost lumber. And maybe there's an argument that we ought to be looser about allowing lumber to be harvested from federal lands, a lot of federal lands, forest land out in the West. But solve that problem, I would say, before you start adding border taxes on the lumber that U.S. companies are relying on right now.
Well, a few things here. You mentioned the electricity. So hydropower will cost as low as 1 cent a kilowatt hour. And these hydropower plants, the dams in Canada, were built ages ago. I mean, you said time, right? We're looking at 50, 60-year time horizon. So Canada has abundance of hydropower, right? And so that makes it really cheap to operate a smelter. Now, smelter produces what is known as primary aluminum. Most of the aluminum made in the U.S. is actually what's known as secondary aluminum, and that's made out of scrap metal. And we import about 2/3 of that from Canada. And so most of that is actually, we're dependent on Canada. Hence, when you impose a tariff on the Canadian scrap metal, and this is what Alcoa CEO is really worried about, is that all of a sudden their company is going to be hurt because of all of our imports from Canada of that scrap metal or primary aluminum for the downstream manufacturers. We used to operate really cheap coal plants, still wouldn't be competitive to hydropower in the U.S., but one of the reasons why so many smelters have gone out of business, and now there are actually only 4 smelters that are operating in the U.S., there have actually been a few that have gone out of business just over the last few years, is to your point, is that the energy costs are increasing, and it's not worth it to invest in upgrading these plants because they're going to be globally uncompetitive. Now, on the lumber point, we actually already imposed a tariff on Canadian lumber in this dispute that has gone back for decades, to be honest, between Canada and the U.S. and timber producers, in which the U.S. lumber industry basically alleges that Canada subsidizes its industry by allowing it to be too cheap to harvest on federal land because much more of Canadian timber is harvested on its public lands than the U.S. More and more in the U.S. is actually harvested on private lands in the southeast versus up in the northwest because of environmental restrictions. That therefore puts U.S. industry at a disadvantage. But to your point, well, if that's the real problem, then there are things that the U.S. could do. It could open up more lands in the northwest, ease some of these endangered species protections on the spotted owl to perhaps make it a little less expensive to harvest timber. But if you just slap 25% tariff on top of the existing tariffs, you're just going to increase the cost of home production and anything else that relies on lumber. And so I think that that's the broader problem with the Trump's tariffs, is that it's really going to hurt consumers at the end of the day, when a lot of the surveys that have been coming out recently, consumer confidence surveys, show that they're already pulling back. They're already worried about higher prices. And this could really hurt the economy. Trump's playing with some fire here.
To that point, the story I'm looking at says that the existing tariff on Canadian lumber is about 15%. So if you add 25% that Trump has threatened on top of that, you push it up to something like 40%. This is a statement from the National Association of Home Builders. It says the lumber tariffs act as a tax on American builders, home buyers, and consumers. And so it raises the question, which Alicia is alluding to here, about whether Trump is still really serious about doing this, or whether this is another round of bluffing and negotiating positioning. It's not clear to me, at least, what he exactly wants from especially Canada, but also on Mexico. There have been some statements made that Canada is going to appoint a fentanyl czar and so forth, though the amount of fentanyl that is coming over the U.S.-Canadian border is minuscule compared to what is coming across the U.S.-Mexico border. And so, Monet, is he really serious about this, do you think? Or is that the great unknown, and maybe he's still watching how the economy is looking and will make that decision later on as we get closer to the beginning of April?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in his first tariff order that came shortly after he took office, people presumed that he was serious to begin with because of how much he had talked about it on the campaign trail. It had kind of become a running gag that if you asked Trump's advisors about the tariffs, they would give one of any different justifications for them, saying that they're going to help to reshore American jobs, saying that they're going to be a tool of negotiation to extract concessions out of America's allies and adversaries alike. But if you ask Trump himself about it, he would tend to answer all three, which gave gave the impression that he really did believe that tariffs would be beneficial. And yet when he decided to delay these tariffs on Canada and Mexico, it seemed as if he was reacting to the reaction of the markets when he first hinted at them. People really seemed to fear the impact that they would have on consumer prices. And so he was willing to accept these kind of paltry concessions, Canada and Mexico both pledging to crack down on fentanyl to save face, essentially. But the fact that he's gone ahead and re-announced them, I think makes it very likely that he actually is going to go ahead and impose them. He probably has been fielding all sorts of advice from his economic advisors about how can we do this in a way that's going to minimize the potential economic damage. But I think he knows that he can't just reveal and announce the tariffs one day, withdraw them the next indefinitely, and that probably would be the worst thing for markets and for investors' ability to make confident decisions moving forward. And so, unfortunately, I think that there's all evidence at the moment that he probably is going to go ahead and impose these, and businesses are going to be making decisions accordingly.